Why countries do not listen to the United Nations? The most recent example is the Israel Palestine conflict, in which both the sides continued to engage in violence despite repeated calls from the United Nations. What happens when UN Security Council resolutions are ignored? The answer is nothing. Nothing happens. No economic sanctions, no military actions. Plenty of countries defy the UN, but in very few cases it is even noticed, and a study by CFR tells us the same. There are essentially no consequences for violating a Security Council resolution. And this is also an answer that countries do not believe that they will suffer even if they defy the UN. Countries believe they won't have to pay the cost of not complying, and that is true in majority of the scenarios. There are a lot of problems with the UN. Let's discuss a few. The veto power and the abuse of veto power. The problem is not that the major veto powers don't care, it is that they care too much. The enormous influence of the veto power has cited as a cause of UN's ineffectiveness in preventing and responding to genocides, violence and human rights violations. The conflicts in Ukraine, Syria and Gaza are an example that Russia and the United States have a great deal at stake in each conflict, and the rules of diplomacy enables them and the other three permanent members, Britain, China and France, to veto. And as of July 2020, Russia or USSR has used its veto 116 times, United States 81 times, UK 29 times, France 16 times and China 16 times as well. In the early days of the United Nations, the Soviet Union was responsible for almost all the vetoes. Because of their frequent vetoes, Soviet ambassador at that time earned the nickname Mr. Veto. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation used its veto power only when necessary. However, Russian vetoes became more common in the early 21st century to block resolutions on conflicts with Russian military involvement, including Georgia, Syria and Ukraine. US cast the first veto in 1970. Since then, the United States have been the most frequent user of the veto power, mainly on resolutions criticizing Israel. China used its veto power sparingly, preferring to abstain rather than veto resolution not directly related to Chinese interests. But since the outbreak of Syrian civil war in 2011, China has joined Russia in many double vetoes. As per a lot of experts, UK and France do not abuse the veto power as much as the others. The UK also used its veto power 7 times in relation to Rhodesia. France used its veto power to block a resolution on questions of the independence of Comoros, which was done to keep island of Mayotte as a French overseas community. The veto power has been criticized for its undemocratic nature. A single country can prevent the majority of Security Council from taking any action. The people with the job of voting no, the permanent representative, are unapologetic. They portray the vetoes are aimed to protect the Security Council's integrity, but that's a lie. The veto only protect the interest of that particular country in almost all the cases. So to solve this problem, a research paper pointed out at a solution, and that was to adopt a voluntary code of conduct, and that would limit the right to veto in cases of genocides, war crimes, crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. France and Britain both support the idea of limiting the veto power in cases of mass atrocities, but this has been ignored by China, Russia and the US. There's another solution for the veto problem: expansion of permanent seats. Security Council must reflect 21st century realities. The number of permanent members should be expanded to include other nations and the non-nuclear powers as well. In the most likely scenario, 4 countries will be included. These countries are called the G4. The G4's primary aim is the permanent member seats on the UN Security Council. The G4 nations comprising of Brazil, Germany, India and Japan are the 4 countries that support each other's bids for permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. These nations are regularly elected to 2-year terms on the Security Council as non-permanent members by their respective regional groups. Collectively, the G4 has spent 64 years on the Security Council since the UN's inception, with each country serving for at least a decade. All the permanent members have supported India's bid for the permanent seat on the Security Council, but China had previously implied that it is only ready to support India's bid for a permanent seat on UNSC if India will not associate its bid with Japan. UK and France have backed the G4's bid for permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council, but there are some problems. Japan's bid is heavily opposed by China, North Korea, Russia and South Korea, who think that Japan still needs to make additional atonement for war crimes that were committed during the World War II. A lot of European countries like Denmark, Netherlands oppose the permanent membership of Germany. And in 2017, it was reported that the G4 nations have been willing to not have the veto power just on temporary basis, of course, if granted a permanent UNSC seat. And according to some media reports, it is highly likely that UN Security Council will expand by 2025. There is a very big problem with the UN and it is hurting the world. That is its inability to prevent and manage conflicts. An early example of this was the Bangladeshi genocide in 1971. It was committed by the Pakistani army against Bangladeshis. Critics of the UN argued that the UN was completely ineffective in preventing the genocide and the military intervention by India was the only thing to stop the mass murder. Another example is the Syrian war. Experts have heavily criticized the UN's inaction on Syria. Moreover, issues relating to the Israel Palestine conflict occupy a large amount of debate, time, resolutions and resources at the United Nations. These discussions date back to the 1940s, but till this date, as we all know, there are no answers. In 2007, even the United Nations Human Rights Council President Doru Romulus Costa said that we have failed in dealing with Israel Palestine conflict. Some people like American lawyer Alan Dershowitz say that UN supports Palestinian militancy. He has accused the UN of allowing its refugee camps in Palestinian territories to be used as terrorist bases. Now let's look at Sri Lanka. The UN admitted that its handling of Sri Lankan civil war, in which thousands of people were killed, was a failure. Due to all of this, the credibility of United Nations is being questioned regularly. The UN's first and second charter mandates require the UN to maintain international peace and security, and if necessary to enforce the peace by taking preventive or enforcement actions. But due to its restrictive administrative structure and the permanent members of the Security Councils themselves have sometimes prevented the UN from fully carrying out its first two mandates, which is of course a shame. Without the unanimous approval or support of all 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the UN Charter only enables it to observe, report and to make recommendation regarding international conflicts. Such unanimity on the Security Council regarding the authorization of armed UN enforcement actions has not always been reached in time to prevent the outbreak of international wars. As you can see, there are a lot of problems. So what are the solution of all these problems? The answer is UN reforms. UN needs reform in a lot of areas, from Security Council to even the General Assembly. The UN General Assembly can only make non-binding recommendations, which is another reason for inefficiency of the UN. Another important area of the UN reform is the Economic and the Social Council of the UN. they are not that successful, as they have been overshadowed by institutions such as IMF and the World Bank. Another major challenge is the UN's financial crisis. It can be said that UN has a lot to do, but it has too little money, as it is in a permanent financial crisis due to the unwillingness of many members to pay their contribution on time. As long as the UN budgets remain tightly constrained, it cannot be effective. UN reforms are hard, but seeing children die in conflict after conflict is even harder.